Thank you, Cousin Adam. So we know that Gaius Bolin was Williams' first African-American graduate. We know the names of the 7 pioneering women who received their diplomas in 1971, and the women in the class of 75, my class, the first group to enter and spend all 4 years at Williams. But who was Williams' first gay graduate? In the first 175 years after the college was founded, the closest thing to a record of LGBT people on campus was an edict from college president Tyler Dennett in 1934, insisting that, any queer boys which come to the attention of the faculty must be reported at once to the assistant dean. You can laugh, it's okay. The recorded history of gay people at Williams begins on October 28, 1971, when this article appeared on the front page of The Advocate, a student paper. The Advocate's editor, Senior Dan Pinello, interviewed a gay student whom he called Roy. Now, what makes the article of particular notice and interest is that after wishing Roy well, Pinello added an important grace note. Oh, by the way, I am Roy. That simple statement, a very difficult one at the time, marked the beginning of an LGBT presence at Williams. And in the spring of '72, Williams had its first openly gay graduate. When the article came out, I was 2 months into my freshman year. I came from a public high school outside of Scranton, Pennsylvania. Before arriving at Williams, I had barely met a prep school graduate, never mind a homosexual. And I was heavily in denial about my own sexual orientation. Whatever part of my 18-year-old psyche was struggling with being gay was battered down even further by the campus's less than welcoming reaction to Dan's article. For context, this was just 2 years after the 1969 Stonewall riots, an event that marks the start of the modern LGBT rights movement. In the preceding years, in public perception, gay people were child molesters, perverts, mentally ill. There was a long list of jobs representing a significant part of the economy that lesbians and gay men were deemed unfit for, and they were dismissed if their sexual orientation was discovered. Not only military service, but any job with the federal or local governments, or hospitals and healthcare, or teaching and education. Gay bashing, the physical kind, was often considered a community service, not a crime, with the police as likely to participate as protect. Being out, being honest to yourself and the people around you was very high risk, and few took it on willingly. So you learned to adapt to the rules of the closet, where important skills included evasion, dissembling, and keeping your head low. While these certainly weren't any of the kind of skills Williams hoped to foster, for many years the campus wound up being a good place to practice them nonetheless. One thing Adam omitted in his introduction: an important part of my CV, after I graduated in 1975, I stayed in Williamstown and ran the log for 2 years. That timing is relevant to a story I'd like to share. After Dan Pinello graduated, there were no gays again at Williams for at least the next 4 years, or more likely, no one who wanted to be identified that way. Then, in April of 1976, the Williams Record published a letter from a small group of gay, lesbian, and bisexual students who had connected with each other and had quietly initiated a support group. They were now going public as the Williams Gay Support Organization, the GSO, and their letter was a vehicle to reach other LGBT students and to initiate a dialogue with their straight peers. They offered a reasoned, understated explanation for the need of the group. First, to talk freely about the problems and frustrations we face in the straight atmosphere of Williams. Then, two specific goals: providing perspective and support for each other, and helping straight students to understand and accept or reject us as individuals. They cited casual insults, hurtful jokes, and the derogatory use of the terms faggot, dyke, gay. If this sounds familiar, it should. Not at Williams. Derogatory terms leading to an overall, if not hostile, leading overall to an uncomfortable, if not hostile environment. And that drove their desire for anonymity. Thus, the letter was signed only with the group's name. The night the letter was published, I was on campus for dinner in the Mission Park Dining Hall with friends from Armstrong House, where I had lived as a student. During the meal, one of the other house members, and let's just call him Joe College, because I don't want to risk embarrassing anyone for something stupid he did 40 years ago, stood on his chair, clinked his glass, and when he had everyone's attention, proceeded to read aloud the WGSO letter in a high-pitched, mocking tone. When he finished and sat down, not one person raised a voice in objection. Not a pretty scene. But what was even worse for me was that I knew who had written the GSO letter, and he was sitting across the table from me. My friend John Atteridge had recently come out to a handful of people, which is how I knew he was one of the GSO's organizers and the author of the letter. Joe College wasn't generally a bad guy, and his attitude wasn't out of step with prevailing beliefs and behaviors far beyond Williams' walls. Excuse me, I'm about to do my best Marco Rubio and grab for the water. The problem with slanted lecterns seems to be, all right, sorry. Joe College couldn't imagine the letter's author was someone he knew well, never mind one of his housemates who was having dinner about 10 feet away from him. And for me, or for anyone who did know who the author was, as a friend of John's, it was painful. As a principled human being, it was sickening. And as a closeted gay man, watching it all unfold was chilling. Over the next several weeks, discussions continued in the pages of the record and throughout the campus. Some voices were raised in support of the GSO, but Joe College was hardly the only person to react badly. And something that seemed to particularly rankle people was the continued anonymity of the gay students. It was gutless, just what you'd expect from fags. You want respect, be a man, show your face. When the next letter appeared from the GSO, it was not anonymous. John signed his name to it. With that simple but courageous act of putting a face on the gay support organization, he silenced some of the haters, and his bravery flew in the face of the ignorant characterizations of the gay community. So much for the comfortable homophobia, and score one for the gutless fags. John was the first gay person I knew. Lacking his self-awareness and his courage, I didn't even start to come out to friends and family until several years later, when I was living in a large city with a sizable LGBT population, notably far away from Williamstown. John went on to become one of the country's leading actuaries. And several years later, before John reached 40, he was one of the casualties of the AIDS epidemic. I had a wonderful 4 years at Williams, or 6 years, depending on how you count it. Like so many alums, I was aware that what I learned, and more generally, that learning how to learn, provides the source of many of the accomplishments that I'm most proud of. My oldest relationships are with my Williams friends, and I have the same strong emotional ties to the school and to what it represents as any other EIF. But until very recently, for me and most other LGBT grads, there was a cost, a trade-off. To enjoy these benefits, you just had to keep a large part of yourself stashed away. Now, of course, the world has changed enormously. The Joe College episode would be inconceivable to anyone at Williams just 10 or 15 years later, never mind now. In fact, so much about those bad old days is really difficult for a younger cohort to even make sense of. Looking from the reverse angle, when we gay baby boomers were in college, I can assure you marriage or any other kinds of LGBT equality were not even a speck on the radar. Openly gay teachers, soldiers, politicians, kids coming out in high school, queers living openly in the Bible Belt. We were just as likely to believe in the tooth fairy. Pun intended. And I have to say that on one hand, Williams wasn't leading the charge to make the changes. In 1978, after the student government proposed that the college's non-discrimination policy be expanded to include sexual orientation, the subject was opposed by President John Chandler and rejected out of hand by the faculty. But also, to be fair, the college wasn't moving any slower than most similar institutions. Williams added sexual orientation to its anti-discrimination policies in 1985, as did Harvard and several other progressive colleges and universities. Other advances in policy and shifts in attitude sometimes occurred slightly before and sometimes slightly after its peer institutions. So here's a question that's bothered me for a while. And it's one of the reasons why I'm so pleased to have been asked to speak here today. Here's the question. If the college wasn't responsible for the bigger societal attitudes, which it wasn't, and it didn't lag behind in responding to change, then why did so many LGBT alums have such ambivalent feelings for an institution that at the same time we're so attached to? The first part of the answer comes with the arrival of the 1980s. Everything changed. Whoops. I'm out of order. Thank you. This New York Times article from 1981 marks the beginning of the plague years. And by the time AIDS penetrated the awareness of the general population, it was firmly associated with gay men. At first, AIDS fed homophobia, and homophobia fed AIDS. And unless you were on the front lines, the closet seemed like a very safe, if not very comfortable, place to continue to hide out. But that was only true to a point. For me, I never expected to spend my 30s attending the funerals of my friends. As the body count mounted and the government and mainstream institutions did nothing, hiding was no longer an option. If no one else would help us, we'd have to help ourselves. The comfort of the closet was overwhelmed by the need to do something. Fear turned to activism. What your boss or your neighbor thought no longer seemed so important. At work, I started pushing for the inclusion of sexual orientation in my company's anti-discrimination policies and the extension of health and other benefits to same-sex domestic partners at the time. Although it was daunting to promote an agenda of social change in the workplace and to come out to your corporate overlords at a time when there were few precedents, it turned out to be worth it. Viacom joined the first wave of corporations to adopt pro-gay policies and started momentum that's important even to this day. I also began to volunteer for an emerging media organization called the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, or GLAAD. While other groups took on the political and legal battles for civil rights, we focused on hearts and minds. GLAAD began to work for fair, accurate, and inclusive representation of the LGBT community at a time when what coverage there was ranged from offensive stereotypes to tragic stereotypes. In fact, in the first years when GLAAD presented its media awards, the bright spots were so few and far between that the bulk of the evening was spent on recognizing and ridiculing the year's outstanding examples of media homophobia. And believe me, there was a lot of competition. Yeah. In the 10 years I was privileged to sit on its board, GLAAD grew in size and influence. It developed a large presence in the newsrooms of Manhattan, the boardrooms of Hollywood, and had a major role in the profound changes that are evident anytime you pick up a paper, look at a TV, or click on most and all mainstream media. I don't know about, is Fox mainstream media? I'm not going there, that's a joke. Bad joke. I'm staying out of that turf. Now, what I've just tried to do is not tell you about my life after Williams, but describe an experience that was so common in the LGBT world at the time. Wherever and whenever you could make the big leap and come out, with that simple act, you became part of a movement to effect change, and there was no going back. To many of us, this is when our relationship with Williams went through a bumpy period. On campus, the college had taken a solid and consistent turn towards diversity and inclusion. For many previously disadvantaged groups, its gay and lesbian students included. But while officially the college made a point of reaching out to its gay alums, it seemed to be looking over its shoulder the whole time to make sure that in doing so, it wasn't upsetting any apple carts. For example, when a handful of LGBT alums wanted to put together an affinity group in the New York area, they had no way to identify or reach people except for those they personally knew. Viral marketing was not yet in the picture. So the college sent out a mailing to its New York alumni list, explaining the situation and telling anyone who was interested exactly who they could be in touch with. Not much different from a baseball game or a gallery opening. Obviously, some alumni didn't see it that way, because shortly thereafter, the New York list received another mailing, this time apologizing to anyone who took offense. Signed, by the way, by a friend of mine who was on the board of trustees and a dean who had greeted me at a reunion at the LGBT alumni gathering. So how are we supposed to react when this happened? At times, there have been noticeable sins of omission. As bicentennial medals and honorary degrees were announced every year, for a long time there was a notable absence of openly gay honorees. And while the college frequently honored leaders and their achievements in pursuit of a more equal and just society, the LGBT movement was not part of those celebrations. So how were we to feel? Well, here's an irony. It's because Williams is so important in our lives that this had such a big impact. For so many of us, and you, or you wouldn't be here, Williams is more than just a place where you spend 4 years. And if you hold a special place in your heart for something, then you aren't looking to just be acknowledged. You want to be embraced. And when this doesn't happen, it hurts. We had reached beyond the point where we were willing to accept tolerance and acceptance. We were looking for full inclusion, full and equal inclusion. You may not remember all the words to the mountains. I certainly don't. But here are a couple of lines. Where alma mater dwelleth with her chosen band. Well, the way I figure it, you're either in the band or you're not. And if you're offering me second-class membership, I'm not interested. Well, as I said before, the world has changed. There's still a long way to go for LGBT people and equal rights, in spite of the stunning advances of the last 10 to 15 years and the changes just in the last 5. Many people don't realize that 28 states don't protect lesbian and gay people from discrimination in the workplace. You can be married on Saturday and fired for it on Monday. Economically, the myth of LGBT affluence is long behind us. It turns out that gay men make 20% less than their peers, and lesbians make slightly less than other women who are already discounted 20% to the male dollar. Economically, the myth of, oh, I said that. Also, although visibility has increased in so many areas, there are a few holdouts. One of them certainly travels over to most colleges and universities, namely in athletics. In major team sports, soccer is the only one where soccer and basketball have each had one athlete come out. In the other team sports, no movement. And if you look at boardrooms, Tim Cook, head of Apple, and the only openly gay CEO in the Fortune 500. On the other hand, Williams is in a place where we hoped we'd all find it. Things have changed so much that it's now celebrated on things have changed so much on campus that it's now celebrated as one of the best 25 schools for LGBT students. We are alphabetically at the bottom of the list. But it happens all the time, doesn't it? The only reason you sometimes wanted to have gone to Amherst. No, sorry. And if alumni feel unwelcome today, I suspect it's because they disengaged long, long ago. Certainly, when you meet Adam, when you meet the alumni staff, with the college having deans and senior administrators who are openly gay, it's not a place that anyone should any longer fear alienated from. So, later today, we'll probably sing the mountains. And though I won't remember the words, on the other hand, at this stage, I know that I and any other gay alums in the audience can rousingly and completely join in. Thanks.